Good morning. It's a great honor to be here. And the fact that such a young scholar like me is invited as a keynote precisely shows the features of this conference. Vibrant, non-hierarchical, and open to new, probably immature ideas, agree to disagree. And am I talking about the conference of polyamory? So let me introduce myself with some temporary labels that are relevant to my talk today. Yes. So, yeah, bisexual, polyamory, and anthropologist. I was born and raised in China, and I first had a monogamous lesbian relationship and then a monogamous heterosexual relationship. And I was struggling with my bisexual desires and before I encountered polyamory. And that was in the Netherlands during my PhD. And a large part of my PhD was about same-sex attracted Chinese men in different sex marriages, which was also spinning around sexual orientation, non-monogamy, and disclosure. So in short, my academic and my personal life are closely intertwined. So my talk today will unfold along those three personal political lines: queer, polyamory, and ethnography. I will put them together like a patchwork, where one piece is connected and furthered by the other. After briefly talking about polyamory, and I will elaborate a life story of a Chinese same-sex attracted man in a different sex marriage. I will also interweave his story, my own struggles with the research ethics when doing fieldwork as a bisexual researcher. Read diffractively, those three patches will together show what honesty and cheating mean for queers, polyamorists, and anthropologists, respectively and intersectionally. And in the end, I will rethink the dynamics between honesty and cheating and propose some adjustment in our poly, queer, and academic life. So let's first look at polyamory. It's hard to define, but when we talk about it, we can often think of a few keywords, such as ethical, responsible, consensual monogamy. The mononormative society tends to have the bias that one is either faithful or cheating. So ethical non-monogamy is just facetious. As a destigmatizing strategy, polys then emphasize that we are not cheaters, highlighting their transparency and ongoing negotiation. Therefore, radical honesty has become a primary ethical principle many polys hold dear. According to most poly handbooks, it means being frank about the wish for loving more, and as opposed to pretend to be faithful forever. It also refers to an everyday practice that radically subverts compulsory monogamy. However, few of the guidelines have framed honesty and cheating beyond individual choices. The economic, social, cultural contradictions that make disclosure easier for some and cheating for others are less discussed. And in our daily life, the strong wish to be radically honest doesn't always make everyone happy. I remember a woman in a poly meetup I met in the Netherlands talking about her struggles. So her husband was mono, and he was willing to stay in a mono-poly relationship, but he simply didn't want to know much about the other lovers she had. On the other hand, she didn't feel comfortable if she doesn't fully disclose her dating experiences. So she wanted her husband not only to accept her poly relationships, but also feel deeply compassion. And her insistence on radical honesty turned out TMI, too much information, for her husband, which tormented her in return. So I started to wonder how the imperative to be honest frustrates both of them. And I will come back to this patch later. So my mixed feelings towards radical honesty are also related to my research on the phenomena of marriage fraud in mainland China. This term mostly refers to a same-sex attracted man marrying an uninformed woman, who later finds it out and feels deceived. Those women are called tongqi, literally wives of gay men. Tongqis have formed their own communities all over China and come forward publicly to condemn their cheating husbands. One quantitative study concludes that roughly 14 million Chinese gay men have got married, framing it as a serious problem. Note that in the remaining part of my talk, I will use the word gay with quotation marks because many married same-sex attraction men in China, they do not assume an essential gay selfhood that goes against their marriage. And this is very important. And citing this very striking yet problematic number, the mass media strongly side with those wives. And tongqi activists and lawyers even proposed to change the marriage law to punish gay husbands. And some gay activists reacted, and they attempted to separate the out and proud gay people from the quote-unquote frauds. So they initiated an online campaign calling gay people to post their selfies with the hashtag, "I'm gay and I won't marry someone of the opposite sex." I would like to pause and highlight that there is definitely mixed orientation marriage everywhere. But in no other places has there emerged a collective identity with strong moral legal claims like tongqi in mainland China. Nor has the Brokeback Mountain turned out a nationwide hatred against gay frauds. So there has to be some cultural, social specificity in this phenomenon. Interestingly, when I talked about my research project, people had very different reactions. Many feminists in China would say angrily that those gay husbands are even worse than straight cheaters because the former are cheating from the very beginning. And people here in Europe often say, "Oh, what a tragedy for both of them." And my poly friends would ask, "Are there any couples trying to open up their marriages?" But there's a common assumption to all those reactions, namely, a gay husband is unable to sincerely love a woman or have sex with her. So the couple must find some remedy, either to divorce, to open up their marriage, or otherwise accept an asexual marriage. And another common point is that they seem to assume an ideal mixed orientation marriage. That is, the gay party comes out, the straight party, the gay party comes out sincerely, better before married, and the straight one accepts it, and they negotiate how to cope with it. It seems difficult for us to imagine how a mixed orientation marriage can ethically work otherwise. So next, I will tell a story of a man who is neither fully passing nor openly gay in his marriage. So Mr. Yao is a civil servant in his 40s. He lives with his wife and a 7-year-old son in a metropolis in southern China, while having secret casual sex via same-sex dating websites. He told me that he had that kind of feeling towards men since very young, but he didn't know the word homosexuality until graduate school. After graduation, he got married with a classmate of his. Like many other gay and tongqi respondents, he took marriage as something actually, quote, "you should do when it's time," unquote. Although at that time, he had already been in an underground relationship with a married middle-aged man, he firmly believed the necessity of a normative marriage for his social status, for continuing his family line, and for his old age. I asked if his wife knew about his sexual orientation. He said, quote, "I might have left some traces when I surfed the internet. She confronted me once, asking if I was gay. I said, certainly not. Of course I wouldn't admit," unquote. So Yao acknowledged that his "certainly not" was probably not convincing at all. He even speculated that his wife had always known about his same-sex attraction, but was just very smart not to poke the paper window. So this is a Chinese saying of unveiling something that everyone knew but just didn't say. Indeed, there is a subtle but significant difference between knowing and revealing, and between acquiescence and announcement. If Yao said, "Yes, I'm gay," he may become a marriage fraud in Chinese context, and his wife may be put in the label of a victim, a tongqi. In this sense, Yao's denial is not necessarily a lying about his gay truth, but can also be a disidentification with the identity politics, or a response to the naming and shaming of gay frauds. And after denying, however, Yao didn't avoid her question altogether. Instead, he tentatively asked her back, quote, "So let's just suppose, what if I were gay? What would you do?" And she said, "I couldn't do anything with it. But you could divorce me," he said. And she said, "Well, if I divorced you and married a straight man, he might still have affairs with other women. Yet, if I've already got a pretty responsible husband, what's the difference?" Unquote. So within a few words, they have exchanged more than what was spoken. Yao's reversion of this "are you gay" question shifts the conversation from inquisition into his true self to a discussion of a hypothetical scenario. As he said, his wife might have already known about his sexual orientation. Therefore, his question is neither fully factual nor purely fictive. Like playing Tai Chi, the couple probed into each other's knowingness in a careful roundabout fashion. Yao's what-if question gave himself some leeway too, because if she turned out non-judgmental or even supportive, it could become a successful coming out. But if she reacted negatively, he could still go back to his earlier denial. So implicitly, he was asking, which truth would you rather live with? And meanwhile, we may interpret the reluctance of Yao's wife to poke the paper window in many ways. It may suggest her tacit acceptance for Yao's untold same-sex attraction. It can also be her fear of divorce, because in China, it's very important socially for a child to live in a complete family. And maybe she thought it unnecessary to know in details what her husband was doing, sexually or otherwise, outside their house. Or perhaps in her perception, having a responsible husband browsing gay porn websites occasionally is as true as, if not more than, having a gay husband who's conducting marriage fraud and made her a poor tongqi. You may have noticed that Yao's wife, in his retelling, used the term responsible to describe him, which shows the pragmatic idea about marriage that is still predominant in China today. So a husband is considered responsible if he has a decent job, provides for the family, takes care of the child, doesn't beat his wife, doesn't cheat, or if he occasionally cheats and gets caught, he returns to the family. So this is responsible. And meanwhile, romantic love and sexual satisfaction can add extra points to a responsible husband, but they are not always the basic requirements for a good husband in China until late 80s. For Chinese individuals who have been tightly bound by the filial obligations towards their family and the reputation in their social circles, and for a country where elder care is mainly provided by the offspring rather than the welfare state, responsibility in marriage is never just a matter of love, sex, and fidelity between two. We should think this notion of responsibility, we shouldn't think it as less progressive than Polis. For the latter, a responsible partner should be honest, good at communication, have safe sex, consensual sex, negotiate continuously, and if things don't work, break up peacefully. Such a feeling-centered understanding of responsibility is closely connected with an egalitarian, contractual prototype of social and intimate life in modernity. Yao and his wife, however, live in the hybrid situation. While China is experiencing rapid individualization and the moralization of loving and sexual marriages, such process is also mingled with the longing for family stability and old age security for gays and straight alike. And Yao continued with his story. He told me that his wife were very close friends in graduate school with him, and they would, quote, talk about everything, unquote. For instance, he said, after taking classes on Marxism, they discussed the patriarchal nature of marriage and agreed that cheating and prostitution are in separate supplements of this institution, which was quite radical among their peers at that time. Perhaps for many polys, Yao's talking about everything sounds fake, because he didn't even disclose his same-sex attraction and his casual sex with men. And besides talking about theories, they never clearly expressed their personal attitudes towards infidelity, nor did they seriously negotiate before or during marriage how to deal with cheating if it ever happens. However, in our daily life, one cannot literally share everything with their partners. We tend to accept that the so-called everything that partners share doesn't have to include every tiny little detail, right? So the crux is homosexuality a deep, dark secret that can never be deemed as a trivia? And are we still able to think of the untold same-sex desire as something minor so that the claim we talk about everything can still be valid? This is, I argue, one of the major flaws of the moralization of radical honesty. It encourages us to tell the deep-rooted truth, yet without unpacking why certain truth is considered so fundamental. Foucault has showed us how homosexuality, among other sexual perversion, has been essentialized and stigmatized in Western modernity. Such a subject-making process is now also materialized in China via psychology and the global gay rights discourse. Once the so-called gay truth is established, it is very difficult to undo it, or to see a husband's occasional same-sex encounters as a mere hobby or friendship, as many Chinese people did not long ago. The construction of the gay truth locks same-sex attracted people in double bind, where they are not only required to stay silent, but also demanded to tell more and more. In separate words, disclosure is at once compulsory and forbidden. Ironically, the two seemingly opposing groups, gay men and tongqis, are in fact symbiotic, created by the same set of knowledge and discourse. For one thing, when tongqis confront their husband's sexual orientation, they tend to crystallize their marriage history into one single storyline, and they think retrospectively, that explains everything. And such a eureka moment is often heard in gay men's self-discovery stories as well. And another commonality is that both groups in China negate the existence of bisexuality, which will be shown in the next patch of the stories. Now, I will shift my experience as a bisexual researcher in studying those mixed orientation marriages. For an anthropologist, informed consent is a basic principle to establish. This is informed consent. It's a basic principle to establish ethical research relationships. Researchers would generally agree that the research need to know as far as possible the topic of the research, the intended results of it, the measures to taken to ensure anonymity so that they can consent to the research based on sufficient information. Theoretically, a researcher doesn't have to tell proactively her own sexual orientation and relationship status as part of the informed consent, because these are deemed as researchers' privacy, right? However, this was more complicated in my fieldwork, because non-disclosure of sexual orientation was precisely an allergy for many Tongqi respondents. But meanwhile, it was very hard for me to be open about my bisexuality. I had to constantly practice image management to the extent that I seemed to be conducting a covert study with several contradictory identities. So I'll tell a bit about how I went into the field. The PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gays, is one of the most influential activist groups in China that supports lesbian and gay children to come out to their parents. And this one is also the one that initiated the hashtag campaign I just showed. As it relies on the born gay and true self rhetoric, and they discourages marriage fraud, it is one of the very few gay groups in China that are welcomed by Tongqi. Introduced by the PFLAG, I accessed online Tongqi peer support group. I informed them of my research purposes and conducted online participant observation. I also interviewed several Tongqis online, one-on-one, offline. Before the interview started, most Tongqis would ask me if I was a Tongqi as well, and if not, then why I was interested in this topic. Understandably, like any storytelling, which is always interpersonal, my Tongqi respondents need to know something about the researcher and the audience before they could select the wording, engage some emotions, assemble certain facts, and ultimately weave into a coherent narrative. So this is understandable. For instance, many Tongqis had expressed upfront their distrust in gay male researchers because they believed that gay men would only defend marriage frauds and defame Tongqis. Some even went so far that they wouldn't want to talk to a lesbian researcher for the same reason. And as for bisexuality, most Tongqis in this group tended to believe it is, quote, just an excuse of the cheaters, unquote, insisting on the innateness and immutability of homosexuality. Knowing these taboos, I tried to avoid talking about my own sexual orientation to Tongqis when introducing myself. However, sometimes I was also asked more directly, are you gay or straight? Neither wanting to lie nor to come out, I would simply answer that I was in a relationship with a man, which was true. And this helped me to get away from further inquisition because a different sex relationship seemed to be enough to establish my straightness until proved otherwise. And scholars have correctly argued that monogamous bisexuals often have difficulties claiming both monogamy and bisexuality because they are simply taken as monosexual. And ironically, however, I experienced such bisexual erasure as a sort of convenience in my fieldwork as much as oppression. Such convenience appeared in my daily life too. My then boyfriend provided me an easy shield in front of my family. I didn't have to falter about my singleness as I did when I was actually seeing a woman. And with a boyfriend, I could easily talk about my relationship as most other straight people do. And my convenient straight appearance made me empathize with Yao and many other married gay respondents, whose normal marriage also saved them from endless gossip and embarrassment. On the other hand, when I talked to the gay activists, my answers to the same question, are you gay or straight, was different. Knowing previously their disparagement on gay bisexuals as, quote, poorly identified homosexuals, unquote, I felt reluctant to disclose my then heterosexual relationship, but simply told them that I used to have a girlfriend, but we broke up, which is also true. Again, bisexuality was erased by my own fear of judgment, together with the peer pressure. And those two statements, I have a boyfriend now and I had a girlfriend before, were both truth and lies. I was made straight and gay in different situations. These labels only became temporarily and partially true through the co-construction of me, my respondents, and the environment. Just like my maneuvering around my bisexuality during the interviews, I had to carefully navigate my opinions on marriage fraud discourse as well. I couldn't promise my Tongqi respondents that I was going to help them to harshly condemn gay frauds in my papers, unlike many journalists did in their one-sided melodramatic reports. When some Tongqi respondents explicitly required me to write in certain ways in my paper, I could only express my understanding and without clearly saying yes or no. And in my later writing, bearing their trust and hope in mind, I tried my best to deliver their narratives comprehensively, including some homophobic expressions attendant to their hurt feelings. However, as an anthropologist, I could hardly be a mere recorder of their voice. The betrayal seems inevitable for a researcher in such an intricate position. My respondents may be displeased when reading my analysis that seems to exonerate the evil gay cheaters in their eyes. They may even withdraw their consent, saying that they were ill-informed about my research purposes and my political stance. So was I being unethical in the field? Was this a problematic covered study due to my incomplete disclosure about myself and my opinions? And am I now finally being honest about my previous dishonesty now? By vulnerably sharing my multiple true selves in the field, I'm not seeking for forgiveness by confession. Rather, I find it more important to think about what made my coming out possible in some cases and passing in others. We should also think to what extent the academic principle of informed consent has put more pressure on researchers with stigmatic traits or identities than others. And in my case, the unspoken truth of bisexuality is always a ticking bomb, which, whether I reveal it or not, may well lead to a trust crisis. And luckily it didn't happen. But Kim Klemmer has warned us researchers to avoid being too voyeuristic when soliciting sexual stories. But here we see that, reversely, a bisexual researcher can also fall into the gaze from the researched. More importantly, even for a perfectly normal anthropologist, without bisexual or other social stigmas, the ambition to tell the respondents all the crucial information is still impossible. As the research question and findings are constantly reshaped during and after the fieldwork, and as the consequences of the research findings are hardly predictable, the informed consent is always incomplete. And so far, we have seen how heteronormative pressure, bisexual erasure, and the moralization of coming out have worked together to put gay and bisexual people in double binds. We're not only demanded to be normal in marriage and in the field, but also candidly confess it if we're not. This is arguably the modern-day variation of Foucault's confessional power in marriage and in academia. Polys, on the other hand, seem to be more optimistic than that our frankness as a self-caring and reciprocal practice is radically different from Foucauldian confession. However, the social effects of Polys honesty are partly overlapping with confession, namely creating more and more knowledge discourse and anxiety about the self. Moreover, as radical honesty becomes a golden principle in poly communities, we seem to be pretty content pretty content with the joke that poly people talk about sex more than we actually do. And we seem to be less tolerant to those so-called cheaters and less patient to understand how a not fully transparent non-monogamous relationship can work. So in the following patch, I will move back to Yao's non-monogamous experiences, hoping to think ethical monogamy beyond truth-telling. As we got more familiar, Yao started to tell me about his unconventional sexual stories, having threesomes with his wife and other single men. His words became much more succinct, and he required me not to use a recorder. Interestingly, their threesomes were practiced neither in a completely non-consensual way nor with radical honesty, which much like how he dealt with his same-sex orientation previously. As Yao was less sexually attracted by his wife, and as she had some trauma that made her nervous in bed and resistant to penetration, they never succeeded in penile-vaginal sex in the first 6 years of marriage. As the reproductive pressure increased, they started to look for solutions. But instead of resorting to marriage therapy, which is quite unpopular in China, or to assisted reproduction technologies, Yao proposed that they could ask another man for help. He boldly suggested that they find a good-looking, sexually more skillful man to make her more relaxed and experienced, so as to be ready for the intercourse with him. His wife rejected this crazy idea until 1 year after, when her own wish to become a mother grew together with the urges from both families. Throughout this year, the couple never seriously exchanged their opinions on non-monogamy. Rather, from time to time, Yao just dropped her some links to adult videos and swingers blogs. They didn't discuss the possibilities of loving more people either, probably because they both tacitly valued their marriage and prioritized the reproductive goal, to which sex, no matter how bizarre, was more of a means than an end. After dating 12 single men respectively via a swingers forum and having protected sex with some of them, Yao's wife started to feel less nervous about penetration, and they too made a baby soon after. Besides the reproductive purpose, however, Yao told me that he has a, quote, private motive, unquote, in having threesomes. He wanted to watch and touch straight men's bodies. And he had previously denied his homosexuality, this private motive had to be kept as a perpetual secret from his wife. Again, Yao was caught between a rock and a hard place. To disclose this desire in their negotiation of non-monogamy is likely to make him a gay man and thus a marriage fraud. To withhold it, on the other hand, may seem to be as being sincere and selfish, thus still being unethical. After his wife got pregnant, they stopped seeking threesomes and never brought this topic up again. Their marriage went on like any other normal one. And according to Yao, both of them are now focusing on parenting and their own careers. When asked if they would like to have more group sex or other sexual exploration in the future, Yao shook his head. He didn't see it necessary to adventure, since he didn't have the reproductive pressure anymore. Plus, he said, quote, "She's a very conservative woman," unquote. Yao used the word conservative or traditional several times in our interview to describe his wife, referring to her shyness, her passiveness in bed, her diligence in parenting and housework, as well as her commitment to this marriage and family. One may see their sexual activities as very liberal and even debauched, yet such promiscuity is not necessarily contradictory with her conservativeness. They are serving the same major goal, to give birth. Or more broadly, the goal to play the normative social roles as normal couples and parents in China. Moreover, this image of being shy and conservative, instead of being openly sex-positive or poly-affirmative, may also be an apt surviving skill for married white-collar women to live normally in their surroundings. Yao's non-disclosure and monogamous appearance seems very unholy. However, instead of simply draw a line between him and us, I hope to think how their lower level of transparency actually worked in their marriage. Throughout all these years, Yao and his wife are surfing the silence and ambiguity most of the time. Within such opacity, together they tacitly trivialized his same-sex attraction and the licentious aspect of their threesomes. They didn't talk and investigate too much in relationships, and they seemed more easily settled with words and behaviors at face value. Poly handbooks tend to have a lower tolerance to non-transparency because they worry that the untold may cause endless suspicion, jealousy, and insecurities. This is true for many of us, but what if opacity can be an antidote to insecurities for others? Admittedly, the whole story is Yao's one-sided narrative, and his wife remains mysterious to me. I used to struggle how I should use this story. Was I doing her injustice by muting her voice? Should I interview her in person so that I can cross-examine Yao's words with hers? And however, my attempt to be fair would be futile and probably even more unethical, because it is Yao's selective disclosure and his wife's vague reactions that made their marriage and threesomes work in the first place. So how could he introduce a researcher to interview her and to break the balance and give voice to the deliberately unspoken? Moreover, we should consider the sex-negative environment in China as well. Being silent and cautious about his sex life helps Yao to survive as a civil servant in China. Even with me, a researcher who promised to anonymize him, there is still a risk of being exposed and penalized. Note that consensual group sex among adults in private is still a crime in China. It's called the crime of group licentiousness. Therefore, speaking simply, is also a sort of self-protection against the oppressive criminal law. Yao's opacity also provides some insights for ethnographers. We tend to carry out in-depth interview, and there seems to be an epistemic prejudice among intellectuals against the surface. The binary between the closet and coming out, between lying and honesty, is easier to spot for queer and poly people who embrace complexity, but fewer efforts are made to complicate the binary between the deep and the surface, the profound and the shallow. To value these simple, fragmented narratives from our respondents and to resist from finding the truth from underneath may be an attempt to break this binary. Now let's take a step back and see what we can get from this whole patch. And they all have directed to three main problems of popular understanding of honesty in poly self-help books and in the accusation of marriage frauds. One is the obsession with deeply rooted truth about one's sexual identities and desires. Two, the prioritization of verbal communication about these truths over other means of interaction in intimate relationships. And thirdly, the highly individualistic and universalizing tone in formulating honesty as a personal choice. Related to the honesty imperative, the research ethics of informed consent also focuses too much on the researcher's personal integrity, while sidelining the stigmas and interpersonal relations that circumscribe a researcher's non-disclosure or disclosure. These three patches also show another common thing, that is the production of ethical subjects by producing its others. Polyactivists have correctly pointed out that mononormativity sets up cheaters as its others, creating a false duality of monogamy versus cheating. Unfortunately, sometimes polyamory tends to use the same othering technique to establish its legitimacy, assertively distinguishing itself from cheating. As a this is okay, never mind. There's something wrong going on. As an ironic result, the cheater becomes a common straw man for both monogamists and polyamorists to legitimize their relationship forms as ethical. In this sense, polyamory is not as subversive as it claims to be. Both monogamy and polyamory take part in the construction of a dichotomy of lying versus truth-telling, putting themselves on the moral end and measuring other modes of life with these yardsticks. Similarly, we can see the othering technique in Chinese gay community. As I mentioned earlier, the response of some out and proud good gay people to the condemnation of marriage fraud is to alienate themselves from bad gay husbands. In order to assimilate to the mainstream, they joined the denunciation of the non-disclosure of same-sex orientation in marriage, while exonerating the social pressure that pushed gay men to marry in the first place. They also put themselves into single destiny, that is, mixed orientation must be deceitful and painful. The obsession with the true sexual identity therefore contributes to the stratification within Chinese gay community, and such stratification further shapes the respectable and despicable gay subjects. Likewise, in anthropological studies, those who conduct covert studies or those who betray the academic demand to obtain informed consent is prone to arousing controversies. However, it is misleading to ask under what circumstances a researcher's dishonesty and its consequential conflict can be excused. Howard Becker sharply reversed this question. Under what circumstances will the report of a study fail to provoke conflict? Can such a failure be justified? This reversion is very powerful and insightful. It questions an anthropologist's very pride to be ethically unproblematic and encourages us not to be afraid to make mistakes in some tricky situations. Critical theorists like Stuart Hall and Judith Butler have explained that it is only by drawing a line between self and others that an identity is constructed. In our cases, the monogamists, polyamorists, gay activists, tongqis, and academics are all trying to draw a line between cheaters and truth-tellers. In return, this line keeps pushing us to conduct endless self-anatomy and self-analysis, to consolidate our identities through such knowledge, to trim the incongruence, and then to reinforce the line. A Sisyphean task indeed. However, the line is quite unstable, and the constitutive outside can never be fully erased. Many polys have openly acknowledged that they used to cheat in monogamous relationships, and some are dating people who are currently in monogamous relationships. So which suggests that our relationships with cheaters are more intimate than we like it to be. The same goes to queer people and anthropologists who conceal or deceive for various reasons. In short, the possibility of being a liar is always haunting every ethical subject. So what do we do about radical honesty? In the end of this talk, I would like to propose 4 possible directions we could go further. First, we should still value honesty in principle. But instead of seeing it as a personal choice, irrelevant to history or geography, we may see it as a luxurious privilege that is contingent on certain social cultural conditions. In societies where ideas of individualization, intimacy as democracy, and pure relationship are more dominant, and where consensual sex between adults is decriminalized, coming out as gay and being openly non-monogamous tend to be more acceptable, and thus actually less struggling. Therefore, while practicing honesty in our own poly life, we could do that with more modesty. And the second and related idea is to decenter radical honesty, putting it in parallel with others seemingly less progressive values, such as family stability, interdependency, and elder care that are equally important for many of us. This may sound unacceptable in an increasingly neoliberal world where everyone is encouraged to pursue their own ideal way of living without bowing to so-called traditional values or social normativity. Here, we should be cautious of another binary, which is non-Western countries are more collectivist and the Westerners are more individualistic. In fact, there are people flaunting their sexuality and people prioritizing normativity everywhere. And I know we have many polymetric organizers and relationship therapists attending this conference today, and I believe you must have many more complicated cases where people weigh and balance different values, and sharing them can bring more diversity to our community. And the third direction is to appreciate the opacity between darkness and transparency. If we bear in the double bind of silencing and confessing in mind, then coming out, candid communication, raising hypothetical questions, speaking simply, disclosing selectively, trivializing, dodging, and acquiescing may all be taken as acceptable and flexible queer poly tactics. Whether they are ethical should not be judged beforehand, but should be carefully examined in every specific context. Such array of tactics takes seriously the potentials of the unknown, the untold, and the ambivalent. And this is where the various forms of non-monogamy becomes truly transformative. Again, I think many of you have much richer stories to tell. And lastly, following the legacy of other movements, polys may even go further and radically embrace the shameful others that are haunting us, like the reverse discourse of slut, queer, negro, and creep in existing civil rights groups. A radical poly politics might as well reclaim the term cheater and redefine it. This is surely not an easy or palatable strategy, but some attempts have already been made. For example, inspired by Peppermint, we may argue that bisexuals and polys are cheating the system. We intentionally break the monosexual and monogamous rules and try to get away with it. So we are cheaters in this way. And in the stories I just told, those who lead a non-normative life in an opaque way are also cheating the impossible moral demand of honesty. And importantly, these strategies do not have to go against one another. It is time that we can further ask a theoretically and politically thought-provoking question. So what if we embrace the paradox and say that we are cheaters and we're not cheaters at the same time? Thank you for your attention.